In today's video, I'll be showing you the 2024 presidential election if the polls were off again in all 50 states. Now, for some context, in both 2016 and 2020, polls severely underestimated former President Donald Trump. For instance, in 2020, Joe Biden was expected to win the popular vote by 8.4% on Election Day. However, he only won the popular vote by 4.5% over Donald Trump, or roughly half of that predicted margin. Now, in some specific states, polls were off by even wider numbers. In the state of Wisconsin, for instance, in 2020, Biden was expected to win the state by over 8%, but he won it in reality by a fraction of 1%, or almost a 8% overestimation of former Vice President and now current President Joe Biden. So as you can see, polls are definitely not very accurate, and in today's video, I'll be looking at the map in all 50 states to see what happens if the polls are off again. Now firstly, in the state of Alabama. In the state of Alabama back in 2020, Donald Trump was expected to win the state by 19.5% when he won it by actually 25.5% or 6% underestimation in support for Donald Trump. Now it doesn't really matter, the state will go safe red nonetheless. Now going to the next state on this list here, the state of Alaska. Right now, Trump has roughly a 7 to 8% advantage over Kamala Harris in the state of Alaska. However, in 2020, you can see that polls were also kind of off, and the average was generally similar. So Alaska does go as likely Republican as you might expect. Now going to the state of Arizona. Currently, Donald Trump does maintain a healthy advantage of about a point against Kamala Harris, especially considering that he has been leading in some of the more recent polls, especially in the NYT/Siena College poll that had just recently been released. NYT is of course a left-leaning website, and the fact that it shows Donald Trump up by 5% is quite remarkable. Additionally, if you look at the 2020 numbers, Biden was expected to win the state by roughly 2.6%, and he was overestimated by a little over 2%. When you factor that in, the state of Arizona is leaning Republican, which is a great sign for Donald Trump because he actually lost the state again like he did in 2020. Now going to the next state, the state of Arkansas. Nothing too surprising here, a 15% margin right now, but polls in the state also underestimated Donald Trump in reality land. So as you can see, the state of Arkansas is going to be safe for the Republican Party. Now going to the state of California. In the state of California right now, Kamala Harris holds a 25.2% advantage. Now in 2020, Joe Biden won the state by 29.2%, which is essentially the same as the polling data. So Kamala Harris, this is her home state, and she's doing about 4% worse than Joe Biden. Not the best performance, and it could signify troubles for her in some of the more suburban areas across the United States or with minority voters. However, the state of California is not really an essential battleground state and will go safe for Kamala Harris. Now going to the state of Colorado. In the state of Colorado right now, Harris has around a 12.5% advantage in the two polls conducted in the state of Colorado. Now in 2020, this was one of the rare exceptions to the overall rule where the states overestimated Joe Biden. The state actually underestimated Biden by roughly a point. So that should be a promising sign for Kamala Harris, but the state of Colorado is definitely not really that competitive. Going to the state of Connecticut here, that's roughly a 16% margin of victory for Kamala Harris, which is rather concerning considering that Biden was overestimated in the state by more than 5%. And if you look at Connecticut in 2020, Biden won the state by 20 points, while polls had him winning by 26.3%. Additionally, right now, she's only leading by about 16%, and when you adjust it for that 6% error in the state of Connecticut, the state goes down as likely blue. Not the most promising when Joe Biden won the state by 20 points. Now going to the state of Delaware. We don't have a lot of polls from the state of Delaware, but Kamala Harris is leading by 17%. Now that is again about a 7% reduction in support compared to polling in 2020. And as a result here in the state of Delaware, that also goes down as likely blue. Not the best news for Kamala Harris, but then again, a win is still technically a win. Going to DC, that's not surprising, safe blue, they don't even have any polls there in this election cycle. Again, DC voted for Joe Biden by roughly 85%, so it's not really something that is considered ultra competitive. Next up is the state of Florida. Now, Florida historically has been an ultra competitive state, regardless if it was 2008 with Obama's landslide victory over John McCain, or 2016 where Donald Trump unexpectedly defeated Hillary Clinton. Florida has always been decided by within 3%. However, in 2020, that threshold was broken when Trump won the state by 3.4%. Right now, he's on track to win it by more, according to polling, by 4.4%. However, when you adjust it with the polling error, his lead expands dramatically. In 2020, Biden was expected to win the state by 2.5%. And when you adjust that error, you see that Trump is actually expected to win the state by more than 10% if the polls were as wrong as they were in 2020. Now, that would obviously be a very good sign, and in fact, a phenomenal sign for the Trump campaign if he's able to win a state like Florida by such a healthy margin. Now, going to the state of Georgia. Georgia is a very competitive state, and Georgia polling historically has been relatively accurate in both 2016 and 2020. In 2020, polls overestimated Joe Biden by roughly 1%. When you tack that on to Trump's 1.4% advantage, probably because of the fact that he's been doing better with some of the minority voters, such as in 2020 where Trump got about 7% of the black vote, in this election he's expected to easily crack double digits and potentially get 15% of that group of voters. Or his inroads with Hispanic voters, that could definitely help him in Atlanta, where the population is. And right now, if you adjust it with the polling error, that does give Trump roughly a 2.5% advantage in Georgia, sufficient for a lean margin. Now, both of these ultra-competitive Sunbelt states, Arizona and Georgia, which are crucial to determine who wins the election, have now gone for Donald Trump by more than 2%. The next state here is the state of Hawaii. Hawaii right now, the more recent polls suggested a tight race between Biden and Trump. Now, I'm not really going to infer much from these polls. I'm still going to put Harris down as a safe projected winner, just because there have been no polls conducted between her and Donald Trump. And next up, the state of Idaho. In Idaho, no polls, but I'm going to give it to Trump because we all know he's going to win that state. Now going to the state of Illinois, Harris was up by 16 in one of the more recent polls, while Joe Biden was up by a similar margin, and polls in Illinois were quite accurate. So Illinois, safe for Kamala Harris. Now going to Indiana here, not surprising, Trump is up by 17% in the more recent poll. However, in 2020, again Trump was underestimated. At one point in time, he was leading by just single digits, just a few days before the election. Of course, Indiana voted for Trump by roughly 16%, which is roughly a 6% underestimation of Donald Trump. So this number right now should be quite promising for the Trump campaign. The state of Indiana is of course safe Republican. Now going to the next state on this list, the state of Iowa. Iowa used to be a more competitive state, and the more recent poll does suggest a 4% victory for Donald Trump. Now that might seem narrow compared to his 8% victory in 2020, however polling in Iowa has never been super accurate. If you look at the 2020 numbers in the state of Iowa, you see that Donald Trump was up by just 1.3% on election day, and just a few days before the election, Joe Biden still maintained a lead in polling in that state. So obviously polling in the state of Iowa has not been the most accurate. So when you adjust it with that error, you can actually see that the state of Iowa goes safe in the Republican column. Now going to the state of Kansas. Kansas, of course, not surprising, the state of Kansas will go for Donald Trump here by a safe margin. We don't really have any head-to-head polls, but Kansas is safe regardless. Now going to the state of Kentucky. Kentucky, of course, there's no polls here, but safe for Donald Trump, the former president. Now going to the next state on this list, the state of Louisiana. Louisiana, unsurprisingly, there have been no polls, but nevertheless, a safe margin here for Donald Trump. That does already boost Trump up to 118 electoral college votes, as Kamala Harris trails behind at 100. The next state on this list will be the state of Maine. Now, Maine's 2nd district, if you look at some of the more recent polls, does suggest that Donald Trump is still the heavily favored to win that district, while Kamala Harris is of course the favorite to win the first, and right now Maine's at-large vote does seem to be somewhere around Harris plus 7 to plus 8. However, I do want to remind you that in 2020, polls in the state of Maine were not necessarily very accurate. Biden was expected to win the state by 13%, while he only won the state by 9%. When you factor all that into consideration and all these different polls and the ranked choice voting system, Maine's 2nd district is considered lean Democratic, the 1st district is safe blue, while the 2nd district is safe red. Now going to the next state here, the state of Maryland. Now, in the state of Maryland, of course, in 2020, Joe Biden was expected to win the state, and Harris is expected right now to win by 28.9%. That's a bit narrower than Biden's actual victory in 2020, but nevertheless, the state of Maryland not expected to be super competitive. However, in the few New England states we filled in right now, it does look like that Kamala Harris is underperforming Joe Biden's performance in 2020. Now going to the next state on this list here, the state of Massachusetts. In Massachusetts right now, Harris has roughly a 30% advantage, slightly less than that, which is generally kind of on par with Biden's performance, though she is down by roughly 6%. That's never a good sign, because although these are very urban states, that could signify a trend that goes beyond these New England states, potentially in Philadelphia, Detroit, or Wisconsin, that Democratic voters are not as engaged as Harris would want them to be. Nevertheless, here the state of Massachusetts, if you're not really analyzing the implications, is still safe blue. The next state on this list here would be the state of Michigan, which is again a crucial battleground state. Now, if you look at Michigan at face value, Harris does enjoy a 2.4% advantage, which many people would believe would mean that she is favored to win the state. However, at least if you look at polling adjusted, that is not necessarily the case. In 2020, Biden enjoyed a much more comfortable 8% margin in the state of Michigan, before subsequently only winning the state by 2.8%, which means the error in the state was roughly 5%. Now, when you adjust that for a 5% error, you can see that Trump is actually ahead if you adjust the polls by 2.6%. Now, not every election will have the same polling error in favor of the same party. However, if that is the case, and again Trump has consistently been underestimated, it does seem like that Donald Trump will win the state of Michigan by a lean margin if the polls were wrong again. Now again, I'm not necessarily saying they will be wrong again, but if they are wrong, that means that Trump will win the state of Michigan by a lean margin. Now the next state on this list will be the state of Minnesota. Minnesota is not supposed to be a competitive state. After all, Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, is literally the governor of the state of Minnesota. Now, right now, Kamala Harris enjoys about a 6% advantage, consistently leading the polls by anywhere from about 4% to about 7%. Now, if you look at the 2020 numbers in the state, polls were not that off. They were off in favor of Biden by roughly 2%, and when you adjust that, that would be a 4% victory for Kamala Harris. Now, although many people will consider a swing state victory for Kamala Harris, especially by 4% in the state of Minnesota, to be quite a good sign, that is actually a very concerning sign for Kamala Harris. This is because her running mate, Tim Walz, is actually the governor of Minnesota, and she's still underperforming Biden's numbers there by roughly 3%. If that's the case, that certainly does not bode well for her in the rest of this map. Now, as you can see, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are both back to the drawing board, after both being at 134 electoral college votes, with exactly 270 left to allocate. Now, the only difference from this and the initial map was the fact that now about half the states have already been filled in. The next state on this map here would be the state of Mississippi, and unsurprisingly, in Mississippi, Donald Trump does hold a lead, although the polls against Harris have not been published in the state of Mississippi. However, Mississippi is still safe Republican. Now going to the state of Missouri here, in 2024, Donald Trump holds a 12% advantage, which is quite commanding. Now in 2020 here, in the same state, Trump only held roughly an 8% advantage. In fact, on one point, on July 4th, National Day in the US, what you see is that Donald Trump only won by 2.4%, was only leading by around 2.5%, or about a quarter of 10%. Now that is a very sharp difference from the polling right now, and it does suggest that Donald Trump is doing better in some of the rural areas, which is essentially what Mississippi and the state of Missouri are filled of. Now, as you can see, a lot of these more northern states, as well as the deep south, have been filling in for Trump, and New England and California have been filling in for Kamala Harris. The next state on this map is the state of Montana, and unsurprisingly, Donald Trump does hold a significant lead over Kamala Harris in the state of Montana. However, that was not the case in 2020, where Donald Trump only held a 4% victory. He's overperforming those polls by roughly 15%, signifying his strength in some of the more rural areas. Now going to the next state here, the state of Nebraska. Nebraska does divide its electoral college votes into congressional districts. It does seem like the 2nd district is awarding its electoral college votes in favor of Kamala Harris. Now in 2020, in the same district in Nebraska's 2nd, I'm just going to show you here, it actually underestimated Joe Biden by roughly 3%. So as you can see, Nebraska's 2nd is expected to go for Harris, while the rest of the state is expected to go for Donald Trump. Now going to the next state on this list, the state of Nevada. Now in the state of Nevada right now, Kamala Harris enjoys a 0.5% advantage. And if you look at these polls here, the plurality of them does show Kamala Harris with a lead, but a lot of polls do have it as even or Trump +1. Now that might look promising for Kamala Harris if you don't understand the context fully. In 2020, Joe Biden was expected to win the state by 5.3%, but he actually won the state by half of that margin, in reality by about 2.4%, or about a 3% margin of error. Even when you subtracted 0.6% that Kamala Harris is leading by right now, Trump is expected to carry the state of Nevada, at least according to the polling error, by 2.3%. Now that would be another lean state for Donald Trump, and it would be a really brutal one for the Democratic Party, considering that even Hillary Clinton, someone who lost the election in 2016, arguably in embarrassing fashion, still won the state by 2.4%. If that state also goes to the Republican Party and Donald Trump, that'd be a really bad sign for Kamala Harris. Now the next state on this list is the state of New Hampshire. In 2024, or right now, Kamala Harris enjoys a 6.9% advantage in the state of New Hampshire, and polling there has been quite consistent, a pretty heavy single-digit lead for Kamala Harris. However, in 2020, polls were off in the state as well, showing Biden with a double-digit advantage, or about 11.1%. Now, Biden only won the state by about 7% in reality, or about a 4% margin of error. When you factor that in, that does give Kamala Harris a 3% margin in the state of New Hampshire, which is better than nothing, but still not the most impressive, considering that Biden won the state by 7 points in reality land. Again, additionally, this is the area where there's a lot of white college-educated voters, and if Kamala Harris is not doing well here, that could signify trouble for her across the nation. Now, the next state on this list here would be the state of New Jersey. New Jersey is not really competitive, but polling here between Joe Biden and Donald Trump had this race as essentially a dead heat. So right now I'm going to put New Jersey in the likely blue column, not safe considering many of these New England states are not considered safe, but then again, I'm not going to put this as a toss-up. The next state on this list here would be the state of New Mexico. Right now, Harris enjoys a 8.2% advantage in that state. However, that is still about 3.5% less than Joe Biden's 11.7% advantage in the same state, New Mexico. However, polling in New Mexico wasn't really off in 2020, so that means that Kamala Harris does win the state of New Mexico by a likely margin. Now, New Mexico could be a big test for Democrats, especially since it's a big question of whether they're able to win back a lot of that Hispanic vote. If Kamala Harris is going to win the state by double digits, that shows that she's really appealing with some of these Hispanic voters. But if the state of New Mexico is actually kind of tight, that could signify major consequences and trouble for Kamala Harris. Now, the next state on this list here would be the state of New York. And in 2020 here, what we see is that the state is actually surprisingly kind of in play. Now, a lot of these margins don't really matter because the electoral vote system is winner takes all. However, this could signify a major problem here for the Harris administration, as well as some of these down-ballot Democrats. Democrats are losing support in New York City, which could harm a lot of these Democrats who are running a very competitive races, often against Republican incumbents. For example, Mike Lawler, who unseated Sean Patrick Maloney, the head of the chair of the DCCC in 2022. If the margin in the presidential level is kind of close, like it is expected right now to be in some of these polls, that could be a good sign for some of these Republicans. Now in 2020, the polls were actually off in the state of New York by roughly 6% in favor of Joe Biden. And when you factor that in, the state goes down to roughly a single-digit victory, or 6 to 7% for Kamala Harris. Not the most impressive margin, but that does boost her up in front of now Donald Trump. Now, the next state on this list here would be the state of North Carolina. Now, right now, Democrats have invested a lot of money in the state, largely thanks to Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate for governor, who has a lot of scandals in the state. Despite the fact that Democratic candidate Josh Stein for the governor's race is leading by essentially high single digits, and in some cases double digits after that scandal came out, Donald Trump still holds a 0.4% advantage, which is quite healthy considering that Joe Biden was expected to win the state for the entirety of the election cycle. And he led by 1.8% on election day, just to lose the state by 1.3% in reality land. Now, this is still a very competitive state, but nevertheless, when you apply the polling error and the fact that Trump is still ahead in the state of North Carolina, you can see that North Carolina is definitely right now leaning towards the Republican Party, giving Trump 180, 90 electoral college votes away, or a third away from the presidency. Now, if you look at the map and the electoral vote count, this might seem like a coin toss election. However, it's important to note that Trump has won essentially every single swing state, with the exceptions of Minnesota, New Hampshire, and the state of Maine, which were pretty obviously must-wins for the Harris administration, and nothing too surprising. Additionally, Trump has flipped 4 states, at least on this map, from Biden's column in 2020, the states of Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan, more than enough for Trump to win the presidential election. Additionally, he has held on to the state of North Carolina. Unless something miraculous happens, like Kamala Harris winning the state of Texas, this would be difficult for Harris to win if this was the actual election map. Now going to this next state here, the state of North Dakota. North Dakota, there's no polls there, but nevertheless, this would be a solid state for Donald Trump. The next state here is the state of Ohio, where there's a lot of white working class voters, and right now Trump wins in the state by 9.5%. If you look at the polls here, it's quite consistent. Trump leads consistently by high single digits to low double digits. However, if you look at 2020, this was not the case back then. In 2020, Trump led in the state by a fraction of 1%. In fact, during some points in this campaign, Joe Biden actually held upwards of a 3% advantage over Donald Trump in the state of Ohio, showing just how impressive Donald Trump's margin of lead here in the state of Ohio of 9.5% truly is. And as a result, when you adjust the polling there, the state of Ohio goes to the Republican Party by 17%, or a safe margin. Now going to the next state here, the state of Oklahoma. Not really surprising, Harris is only down by 16 in Oklahoma, which is somewhat more competitive than what I would expect, but nevertheless Oklahoma, safe for the Republican Party. Now the next state on this map here is the state of Oregon. In the state of Oregon here, surprisingly, we have a competitive race, where Kamala Harris is only winning by about 5%. In 2020, polls in the state overestimated Biden by, get this, also 5%. In fact, by a little more than 5%, so technically 5.2%. And when you actually do some of the rounding and calculations, you find that Donald Trump is favored to win the state of Oregon, at least based on this particular matchup, as well as this particular calculation method, by 0.2%. Now, red Oregon would certainly be a pretty big shocker, and it would be really concerning for the Democratic Party. In fact, even if Oregon is within single digits, that'd be essentially the end of Kamala Harris. And right now, Oregon is in the tilt red column. Now, I cannot say I agree with this characterization, but nevertheless, this is still an interesting map to take a look at. Now, the next state on this map here is going to be the state of Pennsylvania, which would be a crucial battleground state. Right now, Kamala Harris does enjoy a 1.4% advantage. However, in 2020, that pales in comparison to Biden's 4.7% advantage in the state of Pennsylvania, when Biden only won the state by 1.2% in reality land. And when we actually adjust the polling here, what we see is that Trump is expected to end up winning the state by roughly 2.1 percentage points. And that would be, again, considered a lean characterization, which means that, again, Donald Trump wins this state. Now, he's already at 234 electoral college votes, and we still have a bunch of Republican states yet to go to. The state of Pennsylvania will obviously be dependent on essentially around the counties around Philadelphia, Bucks County, Montgomery County, Chester County, and Delaware County, how much it turns out for Democrats, and what the margins are for Kamala Harris in those areas, as well as the white working class areas in Pennsylvania, especially in some of these areas like Monroe County, Lackawanna County, Luzerne County, or Pike County. Now that's where the state of Pennsylvania will be decided upon. As of right now, and this is a conclusion I do agree with, Pennsylvania is leaning towards the Republican Party. Now going to the next state on this list here, the state of Rhode Island. Now in the state of Rhode Island right now, Kamala Harris enjoys roughly a 15% advantage in that state. Now Joe Biden held a 30% advantage in the state over Donald Trump in 2020, and he only won that state by roughly 20% when all the votes were counted. In other words, the state overestimated Biden by 10%. When we adjust that, that's rather concerning for the Democratic Party because it shows that Kamala Harris is only winning the state if the polling is again accurate, and if the polling error is an accurate method, that would only suggest Rhode Island is going to the Democratic Party by 5%. Not great considering it was a 20% state for Biden in 2020. But again, this may not be the most accurate method to illustrate this map, but rather just a hypothetical. Now, the next state on this map would be the state of South Carolina. Now, South Carolina will obviously go for Trump, but we don't have the polls right now, so South Carolina right now will simply be characterized as safe Republican because Trump did win the state by 11.7% in 2020. Now, going to the next state here would be the state of South Dakota. Right now, there are again no polls between Trump and Harris, but Harris does end up trailing in the state because, of course, the state voted for Donald Trump over Joe Biden in 2020 by roughly 25%. Now, the next state on this map here would be the state of Tennessee. Tennessee Senate race back in 2018 was competitive. However, this time round, with the one poll conducted showing Trump up by 26%, the state is not very competitive. In fact, his margin in 2024 is roughly double the margin he had in 2020, suggesting maybe that he is improving in some of the rural areas or even some of the more urban areas surrounding Nashville. Now anyways, Tennessee is of course safe Republican, and in fact if you adjust it for the error, going to Donald Trump by roughly 40%. Now, the next state on this map here is a giant state, the state of Texas. Now, in the state of Texas back in 2020, Donald Trump was only expected to win the state by just over 1%. However, he was underestimated by 4.5%, when in reality land, he again won and prevailed by 5.6%. Now, this time round, Texas is not expected to be competitive, with Kamala Harris essentially diverting no funds into the state, and Trump at 50% with undecided voters still not really breaking. Now, as you can see right now, Donald Trump has consistently been leading in the state of Texas, and that is not really that surprising. Right now, when you adjust it based on the polling error, he is expected to win the state by double digits, or roughly a likely margin of about 10%. Now, the next state on this map here is the state of Utah. We don't have a lot of polls from Utah, but the two polls that were conducted shows Kamala Harris on average trailing by 29%. Now that is a stark contrast to 2020, where Donald Trump was only expected to win the state by roughly 10 points. As you can see, it's either that polling has become more accurate or that Donald Trump is overperforming in some of the more suburban areas around Utah County and Salt Lake County or some of the rural areas. Anyways, Utah will be a safe Republican state. Now going to the next state here, the state of Vermont. In the state of Vermont back in 2020, Biden was expected to win the state by 38.7, and he did win by 35.4. In this time round, there's not a lot of polling, but it does suggest that Harris is up by a significant margin. That is not surprising, and Vermont is going safe for the Democratic Party. Now the next state on this map here would be the state of Virginia. In the state of Virginia right now, Harris has roughly a 6.9% advantage over Donald Trump. Although this may seem impressive, that's only about half the margin that Joe Biden had in the state, 11.8%, and his polls overestimated Joe Biden by roughly 1.7%, and when you subtract that from Kamala Harris's margin, you see that she's only expected to win the state by roughly 5.2%, which is relatively a pretty slim margin, especially when Joe Biden won the state by 10% in 2020, and with a lot of the suburban areas around Richmond, Virginia Beach, and the Washington, D.C. region trending heavily towards the Democratic Party. Anyhow, the state of Virginia is still considered likely blue, suggesting that it's not necessarily that in play, although it could be a challenge for the Democratic Party, and Kamala Harris may have to pour some funds in the state of Virginia. Now going to the next state on this list here, that would be the state of Washington. In the state of Washington right now, in the two most recent polls taken in the state, Harris has roughly a 17% advantage. Now compare that with 2020, and that is again around a 6% underperformance. But nevertheless, this should still give her the state by roughly a likely margin of about 11 to 12%, which is okay for her, especially because some of the states like New York could actually be more competitive on this matchup. Now going to the next state on this list here, the state of West Virginia. In the state of West Virginia back in 2020, polls underestimated Donald Trump in the state by a whole 10%. And this time round, it's nothing too surprising, and it's not rocket science. Donald Trump will win the state of West Virginia again by roughly 40%, which is again a safe characterization. Now there's two states left, the states of Wisconsin and Wyoming. Now in the state of Wisconsin right now, as you can see, Kamala Harris is up by roughly 2%. But as I showed you early on in the video, in 2020, Joe Biden was up by 8.4%, and he only won the state by 0.63%, or a 7.8% overestimation of Joe Biden. When you apply that to some of these polls, you can see that that could be a big problem for Kamala Harris, where she's actually down by 5.8% when you adjust the polls, or a likely characterization. The fact that Kamala Harris's campaign say they're very confident about Wisconsin, and when you adjust these polls to show a completely different story, suggests that the state is definitely still in play. If not, I would argue Trump is the favorite to win the state of Wisconsin. Now finally, going to the state of Wyoming. In the state of Wyoming, this should be no surprise to anyone, but Donald Trump will win the state of Wyoming, boosting him up to 320 electoral college votes over Kamala Harris, who is still stuck at 218, with a difference of 102 electoral college votes. In summary, while many political pundits are starting to speculate or think that Kamala Harris is actually the favorite to win this election, if you look at how wrong the polls are in 2016 and 2020, adjust them based on the previous polling error, and get this map, you'll still see that Donald Trump is the heavy favorite to win this election. If you look at the state of Wisconsin, for instance, polling right now has it at D+2, but when you adjust it, it's at R plus 5.5. Or take another state, for example, like Michigan, where Kamala Harris is up by about 1.5 points, if not a bit more, and in reality, if you adjust the polls there again, it actually goes to Donald Trump by roughly 3%. You'll see that Kamala Harris's campaign, if the polls are wrong again, like many people, including more liberal pundits like Nate Silver would expect, you would still see that Donald Trump is still the favorite, if not the heavy favorite to win this election, if the polls were wrong again. Anyways, thank you for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.